We are back on. You can hear me. This is exciting. Welcome back, everyone. We are after lunch at our lunch keynote presentation, and we are delighted that you all came back. Let's everyone wave to our virtual participants. Hello, virtual participants. We're so glad you're here. We're virtually waving. I am so glad that you're back. I hope everyone had a good lunch and a very busy morning. You are in for a real treat for our next speaker, but I wanted to introduce our welcome introducer. Does that make sense? Mrs. Sylvia Arenas. She is a councilwoman for the city of San Jose, and we are really honored to have her here, and she is an inclusion champion. So I'm going to let you introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I didn't know I was going to go after lunch, although with the 1 o'clock speaking time, I should have assumed that. So now I'm competing with hopefully a light lunch, and I'm going to compete for your attention here. But I'm honored to be here today. My name is Sylvia. I'm a city council member, and maybe some of you have worked with Nancy Crow. She actually invited me here, so I'm really grateful for that invitation, and for Kathy and Kim and Julie and Myra and everybody who's worked to make this a reality. So thank you, everyone. This is the 3rd annual Inclusion Collaborative. And I have an amazing opportunity to introduce an amazing person. And before I do that, I wanted to share with you why I'm particularly honored to be here today. I worked for First Five for about 10, 12 years. Does anybody know about First Five? Yeah, I'm sure that everybody here has heard about First Five, maybe working directly with or throughout the system of care that they have here in Santa Clara County. So I worked there for a really long time. Obviously, I'm a believer in early intervention. And while I was there, I had my first child, and I had him at 29 weeks, and so he was a little under 3 pounds. So that was a really scary time for me. But I was so grateful, and I was comforted that I was in an agency that really understood my needs and my child's needs. What I wasn't prepared for later on as he grew and was in school, elementary school, was having such a difficult time to secure services for him. I thought, how ironic this is, that I worked every day for more than 10 years to support families, and here I am standing on the other side. And when my son, really from an early age, as early as 4, when he was in preschool, because of course he was in transitional kinder, he was in preschool, he was so perceptive and aware that he learned differently, that he couldn't remember things, that he would forget almost instantly. And it hurt so much as a mom, as somebody who's an advocate for early childhood education and intervention. It hurt really to see his process this closely. You know, I'd seen families come through our system of care. I'd had many roles in First Five and drug court and regional partnerships, and just in so many different roles. That's how I had the opportunity to meet Nancy Crow, actually. And when my son said to me, there was one particular day where he came home, and there was, there's school-based projects nowadays, and that's kind of the emphasis, and sure, at that early age, that's what they typically focus on, aside from just sitting in a chair for a really long time and trying to focus, right? So my son said, he felt he was dumb and just less than the other kids in his classroom. And for all of you who are mothers or fathers or aunties or advocates of children in our community, you understand how much that hurts. And it just created a rage inside of me of wanting to really change things, not only for my son, but for other children just like him. And so I decided to run for the Evergreen School Board. I don't know if that was the smartest thing to do because I was pregnant again with my second child. I was working full-time. I was working on my master's. And then I was running for school board. And of course, somebody said I was crazy. And I said, you know, I'd be crazy not to. So I'm happy to share that I did win that election, and that set me up really to learn a lot more about public policy. And of course, now as a council member, that's what my primary focus is changing really the rules for everyone. Not only in our school system, well, that no longer is my area of focus, but at a really broader area for all of our families so that they can then support their children. So I know that many of you here share the same passion and feelings as I do, and that's why you're here learning about best practices, the latest research-based best practices, so that you can continue to implement in your own respective programs or in your own communities. And so I thank you for being here and standing tall and strong for our children, because all of you represent an opportunity for our children. So enough about me. I'm really here to introduce somebody that I believe shares the same passion, and he values inclusion and diversity. He has broken many stereotypes. And of course, I'm speaking of Michael Hingson. His life story is incredible. He was in high-tech sales. I talked to him earlier, and I met him, and I can see that he was a salesman for a really long time. And I mean that in a really good way. That's what I say now, right? Until a day that changed his life and frankly changed the lives of all of us as a nation. He is a survivor of the 9/11 attacks that claimed so many American lives. And Michael was on the 78th floor of the World Trade Center. And on that day, he held his own. He and his guide dog, Roselle, walked down 78 flights of stairs and created an environment of strength and calmness for those who were going down those stairs with him. I believe that was a turning point for him, and he became a motivational speaker, and I see sometimes our struggles, and that's why I shared this earlier, our struggles, things that really challenge us sometimes makes us change and shifts our course in our lives. And it might be harder or more difficult, but our passion sometimes guides us, and I believe that that's what happened with Michael. He is now a motivational speaker, a social advocate. He's an author of 2 books. The first one is Thunderdog, published in 2011, and the second one is Running with, am I saying this correctly, Roselle, in 2013. He also has, he's a very accomplished academically, and so he has a master's in physics from UC Irvine, as well as a teaching credential. So he comes with much experience. And I think his book really encourages all of us to break through those stereotypes. We truly don't know what we're capable of until we are tested. And we're tested throughout our lives quite a bit. And not to let sight get in the way of your vision. Now I'm quoting from his book, Thunderdog. So it is my distinct honor to introduce Michael Hingson. Thank you.
talking yet. There it is. There it is. Ain't science a beautiful thing? Well, thank you, Sylvia. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for that introduction and for your words. I do have to confess, technology sort of works. I do have to confess I'm not a great fan of diversity. How's that for a scary comment? I believe that as a society, we have warped the concept of diversity. We talk about diversity in terms of race and religion and so on. Very rarely does diversity ever get used truly in the same sentence and at the same time to talk about disabilities. I've been to a number of diversity meetings, and if disabilities are mentioned at all, it's kind of at the end of a list. Inclusion's a different story. You either are or you're not. Well, we're trying to be inclusive. No, you are inclusive or you're not. Here's an example of why we still have a ways to go. And I'm not trying to pick on anyone. Really, I told Kathy I was going to pick on someone, but I'm not. But I have an observation. This morning, our assistant superintendent, Mary Ann, did some housekeeping chores with us, and she talked about what to do in case of an earthquake. And one of the things she said was duck and cover, and then when we exit through this door. Right? And I understand that. We live in a vision-centric world. We don't live in an inclusive world yet. That's what we have to deal with. That is the issue that we have to address. And that's why we're here today. So I'd like to actually start by introducing you to my friend and my colleague. This is Africa. Come here, Africa. Come on up here. Come. There's Africa. Come on up. There's Africa. Hi. Good girl. She says, you know, I was going to go to sleep. What's the deal? Africa is a guide dog from Guide Dogs for the Blind. She is my 7th dog. She will be retiring in February after 9.5 years, so we're excited about that. So let me ask y'all, talking about inclusion and such, how many of you ever heard of Dr. Jacobus Tenbrook? Okay, how many of you heard of Martin Luther King? Okay, so last question. How many of you think it's a bright idea that when a blind person who is lecturing you asks you a question that you respond by raising your hands? Let's get back to that inclusion thing again. Dr. Jacobus Tenbrook was the founder of the National Federation of the Blind. But first, before that, he was a constitutional law scholar teaching at the University of California at Berkeley and was one of the most prominent constitutional law scholars of the 20th century. His treatises on tort law and so on are still used even today and referred to. There's even a Jacobus Tenbrook Society, I believe still exists at Berkeley. I want to read you something that came from remarks that he gave at the 1967 convention of the National Federation of the Blind. The speech was entitled, "Are We Equal to the Challenge?" And it was delivered to blind people. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase it because I think that the remarks that he made at that speech and some other remarks I'll read to you later really are just as relevant for any person who is different than anyone else, any person with a disability or whatever. And we'll deal with disabilities here. So I'm going to paraphrase this because he wrote it and gave the remarks for blind people. But he said, persons with disability have a right to live in the world. That right is as deep as human nature, as pervasive as the need for social existence, as ubiquitous as the human race, as invincible as the human spirit. As their souls are their own, so their destiny must be their own. Their salvation or failure lies within their own choice and responsibility. That choice cannot be precluded, prejudged. Those lives cannot be predetermined or controlled. The right to live in the world. That concept, I think, is as amazing and as interesting and as profound as he or anyone else could ever say. Those of us who happen to be different because we have what people classify as a disability, and I'm not going to get into political semantics, political correctness, those of us who supposedly have these things called disabilities have as much the right to live in the world as any of you, period, end of report. And anyone who may say, well, yeah, we buy that, but then go off and immediately do things that demonstrate that they truly don't believe that we're as capable as they, that tends to be the problem that we have to face. I believe that all of us have gifts. I and lots of blind people and other persons with disabilities for that matter are in a battle in Congress right now. There is a law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that was originally passed in 1938 that includes a section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And originally, that section was established when they were creating minimum wage for people, work weeks, and all the other things that go into workers' rights. This one section created what are called workshops. The workshops were supposed to be training mechanisms by which people with disabilities could be taught to work in the world, because the presumption was we couldn't. And during the time that people were at these training sessions, they could be paid as low as 75% of the minimum wage. The only way you could pay someone less than minimum wage was to demonstrate that when they first went into the workshop, they could not work at a competitive rate as everyone else. But the idea behind the workshops was to train people so that they could then go out into the world and work competitively. The workshops warped and morphed that concept to the point where they now are entities in of themselves. And they also got the legislature, the Congress, to change the floor for what could be paid to zero. There are people legitimately in these workshop environments who under the law are being paid 0 cents an hour, 20 cents an hour, 50 cents an hour. And the workshops have created warped mechanisms to say they can't be competitive. I know blind people with college degrees. I know people with developmental disabilities. I know people with other physical disabilities who are in these workshops and are trapped in an environment that is totally inappropriate, immoral, but legal today. I submit that even most everyone who has a so-called developmental disability can work competitively at something. The problem is the workshops that were training mechanisms have completely dropped the whole concept of doing evaluations to find out what job a person can do and then training them to do that well. Now the workshops go off and they look for contracts and they bid on government contracts and they have most favored status in getting those contracts because of the fact that they're who they are. So they get these contracts, very lucrative ones. They're also nonprofits, so they can also solicit funding from the public for their nonprofit status, and they can pay less than minimum wage to people if they just demonstrate, well, they can't possibly do the work at a competitive rate. How do they determine what's competitive? Let's take a blind person, for example, a sighted person, and find a job that they want a blind person to do and say, do this job for 25 minutes. Now take a break. Do it again for 25 minutes. That's the rate that a blind person has to work at for 40 hours a week, week in and week out, to do the job. Never mind whether they're even competent or not competent, but capable or have the gifts to do that particular job. That's how they determine what is competitive. And I know people, as I said, with college degrees who get $2 an hour, $1 an hour, because it's legal. That's not an inclusive society. And that reinforces the stereotype that says, we're different, we're not as good as the rest of you. That's unfortunate. It starts all too often at a very early age because, let's take again blindness, but it doesn't matter whether it is or isn't. It starts at an early age because parents have learned themselves to be afraid of these disabilities. When I was born, I was born 2 months premature and only weighed 2 pounds, 13 ounces. I haven't gained a lot of weight since then. I'm still doing pretty good. Stayed on Weight Watchers for the last 67 years. And I was given a pure oxygen environment and became blind due to a condition known as retrolental fibroplasia. Now, to give you an idea of the competence of our scientific community, Dr. Arnold Paps at the Wilmer Eye Institute in Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland, had already decided that a pure oxygen environment was a risk factor for causing blindness for any child that was put in an incubator and given a pure oxygen environment day in and day out. He went to the National Institutes of Health and he went to the National Science Foundation and he said, I have got case after case to prove that blindness can be caused by an overly oxygen-rich environment, and that even if you change the environment for a few minutes, the incidence of blindness drops to 0. The doctors, the experts said, you're crazy. How can it possibly be that that kind of oxygen-rich environment causes blindness? After all we breathe in and what we survive on is oxygen, so how can that be a problem? Never addressing the issue that too much of a good thing can be a problem with anything. Today we know that Dr. Paps is right, but I became blind from it. At 4 months old, it was discovered that I had lost my eyesight. My aunt was observing me one day and said to my mother that it didn't appear as if I reacted to sunlight, and she was wondering if I was blind. And they took me to the hospital and they examined me, and the doctor said, he is blind. And what you should do, because he is blind, is send him to a home. Send him away, because no blind child could ever amount to be any kind of a contributor in society, and all he will do would be to destroy your family dynamic and not be good for your older son who could see. My parents took the very unusual and odd step of saying, you're wrong. He can grow up to do anything that he wants. Blindness isn't going to be the problem for him. He can grow up and do what he chooses, and we're going to give him every opportunity, and they did. So I grew up believing that I could do whatever I chose to do. Yeah, recognizing that eyesight could be a problem, but I could do whatever I chose, and it was really up to me. I went to a special kindergarten class for blind kids in Chicago, where we were living until I was 5. I learned Braille. I learned some basic skills. The class came about because my parents and the parents of other prematurely born blind children, the whole baby boomer issue, all advocated for the special class, and the school system agreed. But after kindergarten, I had to move to California because my father got a job in California, and so went out there, and what do you think? California starts kindergarten when you're 5, so I had a second year of kindergarten, and it wasn't even my doing. But you know, kindergarten's kindergarten, so it's okay. The problem is I didn't have any special training or classes in that kindergarten. We were in a very rural town of Palmdale, California, and so didn't have access to any of that. And I forgot the Braille that I learned. Didn't get to use it in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. But my parents kept working with me on our lessons. I learned to do math in my head. I was doing algebra by the time I was 6. My father was a self-taught electronics and electrical engineer, and because he only had an 8th grade education himself. My mother had a high school diploma. But my father taught me skills. My mother taught me skills. When we did spelling tests in school, I didn't get to write the words down because I didn't know Braille, and nobody could read Braille anyway. So what did we do? After everyone did their spelling tests, they traded their papers, and then I had to spell the words out loud for everyone, and better get them all right, because if I didn't get something right, it was embarrassing, I got to tell you. And I remember one time I missed a word, and I knew I was missing it, and I just couldn't remember it. And I heard about it for a while from the students. I don't know whether that was the beginning of a public speaking career or not, but possibly it was. In any case, between 3rd and 4th grade, the Antelope Valley Joint Union, well, no, that was high school. The Palmdale High School District hired a resource teacher because there were a number of blind and partially sighted kids in the classroom in that area, and I was able to, again, regain Braille skills and learn some of the other skills that I needed. I didn't use a cane. I didn't use a dog. I didn't need to, I thought, because in reality I could walk to school. I even rode my bike to school. Rode a bike almost every day. It was rural enough where I could hear what was going on around me, and it was a safe thing to do. I remember coming in one Saturday after riding my bike around the neighborhood and having a good old time, and I came in after putting the bike in the garage, and the phone rang about the time I got in the house. My dad answered the phone, and the conversation went like this, as he told us later. He said, "Hello." And the guy on the other end of the phone said, "I'm calling you about your kid." And my dad said, "Well, okay, what about him?" "Well, he was out riding his bike." And my dad said, "Well, okay, so?" No, you don't understand. I'm not talking about the older one who can see. I'm talking about the young one." And my dad said, "Well, okay." "Well, he's blind." "Well, yeah." "Well, he was out riding his bike." And my dad said, "Yeah." "Well, he can't do that." And my dad said, "He was doing it. What's the problem?" And the guy said, "Well, he's blind." And my dad said, "Did he hit anyone?" "Well, no." "Did anyone hit him?" "No." "Did anyone get hurt?" "Well, no." "Did he get hurt?" "No." "Well, what's the problem?" And the guy hung up. He could not deal with the fact that I happened to be blind. Blindness is a characteristic. It is no different than being left-handed, no different than having a skin color, no different than being male or female or whatever. It's a characteristic. It's not a fallacy. But that neighbor couldn't deal with it because we live in such a vision-centric world, and that we need to change. And it's really not different today. A lot of things have changed in terms of technological advances and so on, but attitudes overall, deep down, really haven't changed. Otherwise, diversity would include more of an involvement of disabilities. Senator Kerry, when he was running for president of the United States back in 2004, opened an office in San Rafael, California. We lived in Novato at the time. By the way, we're interested in some of those kinds of things, as I'm going to describe to you, because my wife also is a person with a so-called disability. She has been in a wheelchair her whole life. There is some scar tissue on her spinal cord from birth. So we got married in 1982. It's a great marriage. She reads, I push, works out well. Except now she uses a power chair. But when we discovered the announcement about Senator Kerry opening his office, one of the things it said on the second floor of building whatever address it is. And the article was there because somebody in a wheelchair had gone by and discovered that there was no elevator to go to the second floor. So the Kerry for President campaign was confronted with that issue, and they said, oh, yeah, we're going to work on it. We'll fix it. But there was a party, a campaign office opening party that was coming up. And they said, we're going to have to wait till after that's done. And as one of the people in the wheelchair said, so we're not invited to the party. And that's really the message. We're not invited to the party. We don't get the same access or involvement. But in reality, we do have the same right to live in the world, and we shouldn't be left out simply because we're different than you. Or as we say down in Texas, all y'all. I spent enough time down there. I learned how to talk good. Anyway, the fact is that it happens all too often. I went to high school and was denied access during my freshman year to ride on the school bus because the superintendent of the Antelope Valley Joint Union High School District had a rule in our school handbook that said no live animals were allowed on the school bus. And we had decided by the time I was going into high school that I should have a guide dog because it's a much bigger area. It's going to be harder to hear what's around me because of the crowds of people and so on. And in reality, I really needed something of a mobility device or whatever to help me get around better. And so I was able to get a guide dog. The normal rule at that time was 16 to get a dog, but they took pity on me, or they decided that I might be competent to use a guide dog, and so I got one. Went to high school, and one day was called into the office of the vice principal, who said that I would no longer be allowed on the school bus because no live animals allowed. Mr. Fisher, the vice principal, and I were good friends. And he and I spoke about it. I said, but Mr. Fisher, there's a state law in California. At that time, it was in section 643.5 of the Penal Code of the state of California. And the law said that it was a felony to deny a blind person the right to take their guide dog with them on any public conveyance or transportation, any common carrier, into any lodging, hotel, restaurant, and so on and so on. I said, so Mr. Fisher, that violates the law. He said, yeah, well, the superintendent said that in reality, you can't take your dog because it violates the rule. I took that message home to my parents. By the way, they did say that they were going to hire someone to take me to school in their car. Under the law, what do you think it makes that car? Last time I checked, it made it a school bus under the law. Yeah. So hello, but didn't matter. It's the separate and not even equal concept. Anyway, we demanded a ruling and a meeting with the school board over the subject. My father went to the library and studied every law book he could find. He discovered Black's Law Dictionary that defined a common carrier under case law to be inclusive of school buses. So they really were violating the law. Well, the day of the meeting came, we went to the meeting, board business was conducted, then it came time to hear our case. The superintendent got up and said, this is really simple, we got a rule, and this is the rule, and they're violating the rule, we can't allow that dog on the bus, that's it. The chair of the school board was a lawyer. He also happened to preside at my Star Boy Scout Court of Honor. He was someone that we got to know. He turned to my dad and said, Mr. Hingson, do you have anything to say? And my dad said, yes, I do. The superintendent's right, it's very simple. Section 643.5 of the Penal Code of the state of California says that my son is allowed to take his guide dog on the school bus because under Black's Law Dictionary, it's a common carrier. And so the only question you all have to answer today is, which one of you wants to spend a year in the penitentiary and pay a $1,000 fine? The board voted 3-2 to go with the superintendent. It took a letter from us to the governor breaking down the entire case, outlining everything to get the superintendent, we would love to know what really happened, but still don't, we can imagine, to be summoned to Sacramento, and the next week I was back on the bus. But what did I learn from that? I learned that people were going to treat me different because I was blind. I also learned, however, that you can fight City Hall and you can win if you're right and if you have a good case, and that you should stand up for what's right. And I've lived my life that way. I went to college, I got a master's degree in physics. I was very fortunate. I chose to go to the University of California at Irvine, where they had an office for students with disabilities where the person who didn't know better. Instead of hiring readers for me, instead of doing all sorts of services for me, instead of demanding that instructors provide me the information in advance so that I could get my textbooks, Jan Jenkins, later Jan Juergens, said, you got to do all that stuff. But here's what my office will do. If you don't get the cooperation from professors that you should, you come and tell me, and we'll get the chancellor involved. And she said, by the way, you know, you ought to go meet Chancellor Dan and get to know him a little better. And I'd met him once, but I went and spent some time with him and got to know him and learned that when you go to college, especially when you're different, good to meet the chancellor. I didn't ever have to invoke the powers, but I learned from him, and it was great to just spend some time with someone who clearly was in a very significant position of importance, but who was willing to take the time to get to know me. And he asked as many questions as I did. We had several good conversations. And so I did have a couple of times when professors would not give me information in advance so I could get textbooks procured to get them transcribed into Braille and used in the classroom. But mostly, the word got around that wasn't a good idea, and we got information when we needed it. So I got a master's degree in physics. I also procured a secondary teaching credential. I took all the same courses as everyone else. I student taught like everyone else. I even took that secret course that they never tell people about, and I can talk about it here because all y'all are teachers. I told you I can talk Texan. You all are teachers, and you know that one Voice 101 where you learn how to yell at kids? Yeah, I took that course. So I also worked at the campus radio station for 6 years, and then along the way, I heard about a guy named Ray Kurzweil. I had joined the National Federation of the Blind, which is a civil rights social action organization of blind people. And I learned that this guy Kurzweil had come to the Federation because they asked me what I thought of the concept. And he said, I've got a machine that will scan a page of printed material, whether it's typed or printed with proportionally spaced material, or a combination. It has a whole bunch of type spots on it, and it'll read it out loud. It's got a computer that will recognize the characters. That was unheard of in 1974. There was such a thing as optical character recognition, but it was many hundreds of thousands of dollars for a computer that could do it, and it could only read one type style at a time. Ray Kurzweil, take and read any combination of type styles all at once. A very revolutionary thing. And he decided that the first job that he wanted his machine to do was to read print out loud for blind people. But he needed money. And he went around and couldn't find any, went to the National Federation of the Blind. The National Federation of the Blind said, well, let's see. We don't believe that you really got something that's all that great, but they went and brought their own material. They went to Cambridge, brought their own material, and what the heck, it read it all. So they worked with Ray to develop a program to get several of the machines in the hands of blind people. A very revolutionary thing, taking prototypes totally out of the manufacturing environment and putting them in locations where blind people could use them and where they could provide feedback and recommendations as to what really needed to go into the final production model of the machine. I was hired to travel around the country after getting my master's degree. I was hired to write training curriculum, set the machines up, sometimes repair them, and observe people using them, and eventually write a series of recommendations that went into the first production model of the machine. In 1978, when the project was over, I was hired by Kurzweil to go and do the same thing within the company. I did it for about 6 months, and then I was called into the office of the Vice President of Marketing, and I was told, we're laying you off. I went, why? Well, it's not that you've done anything bad, it's not that you're not good at your job, but we've hired too many people at something that a lot of engineering companies do, and we need more revenue producers, so we have to lay you off because we just can't spend the money on your job. It's just not as crucial as getting in revenue, so that's what we're going to have to do. And then there was a pause. Unless you're willing to go into sales. And we don't want you to sell the reading machine for the blind. We want you to sell the new higher-end commercial version that scans printed material for companies and so on, like law firms, publishers, banks, and so on that need to digitize data. And it didn't sell for $50,000 like the Kurzweil reading machine for the blind did at that time. It sold for $125,000. I had never sold anything other than occasionally a newspaper. So I had to give it some very serious thought, maybe about 1/10 of a microsecond, and said, sure. I had moved to Boston and had no desire to go find a new job because I knew that the unemployment rate among employable blind people, even at that time, was over 70%. 70%. And it's still close to that today, even though in our world, the unemployment rate among society is 4.2%. It is not that people who are blind or have other disabilities can't do the work, it's that people think we can't do the work. So I went into sales and I worked for several companies and eventually wound up working for Quantum Corporation, which was a company that manufactured disaster recovery products. Products that were used to back up data and store it off-site so that if there were ever an emergency, the data could be recovered and business could continue as usual. So for example, we backed up, our company backed up data or sold the products that backed up data on magnetic tape. Every Wall Street firm, every securities firm, investment firm, had to back up their data at least once a day anyway, and they had to keep it off-site for 7 years, just in case there were ever an emergency. And so we sold the products. I was hired by Quantum in 1999, that was the latest job that I had, to open an office for them in New York. And that brings us to the real story. I wanted you to hear all that we've just talked about as background so that you kind of understand my mindset and my attitude and kind of where I came from. We opened the office in 1999, but we opened a more permanent office in August of 2000. We opened the office on the 78th floor of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. Why did we do it in the World Trade Center? Well, there was this bombing that took place in 1993, and the occupancy rate of the World Trade Center was still low, like 85%. And real estate was really great then from a pricing standpoint. I got 1,400 square feet of real estate on the 78th floor of the World Trade Center at $2 a square foot. Some of us know how to negotiate. But anyway, it was great. It wasn't even much negotiating. I mean, who can get office space for that? But that's what we got. And so we moved in, set up the facility, and I hired a sales staff. I hired a support staff, and we went to work. We always well overachieved our goals, our sales goals. We were productive and certainly a good representation of the company. I worked with my sales staff, trained them how to sell our products better than they did. One of the things I asked every sales guy I hired was, what are you going to sell for us? Now, I had my own thoughts as to what the answer to that ought to be, but most of them said, oh, we're going to sell your tape drives and all that sort of stuff. Why do you ask? I said, well, is that what you're going to sell? And, yeah. One guy, Kevin, came in. By the way, not relevant, but I'll just tell you to point out differences. Kevin happens to be African American. Kevin comes in, and I said, Kevin, what are we going to sell? What are you going to sell for us if we hire you? And Kevin said, the only thing I have to sell is my reputation and myself. Everything else is stuff. That was the answer I was looking for. I would have loved to have had a whole staff of Kevins, but I had one. That was a good start. Kevin came into my office one day and he said, hey, Mike, I've got some contacts at Solomon Brothers who say they want us to come out. That was one of his accounts. And they want us to do a presentation. I don't think our product's going to work, but they really want us to come out and really clarify and verify, and they want to learn about us and so on. And they want me to bring my manager. So he said, it's all set up for next Wednesday. And I didn't tell him you're blind. I said, well, it's a good thing you didn't tell him. They don't need to know that. It's not relevant. He said, yeah, but I didn't think they ought to know that anyway. They're going to find out soon enough. And I knew what Kevin meant. The meeting was for 10 o'clock in the morning, and we got there at 10:01. Deliberately, I was carrying a laptop projector. I was carrying my briefcase with all sorts of things in it. As we walked down the hall, heard the conversation. We walked in the door at 10:01. I'm sure people were starting to wonder why we weren't there yet, and everything just stopped dead. They see this blind guy walking in with a laptop projector when they asked Kevin to bring his manager. He's got a briefcase, and they asked Kevin to bring his manager, and this blind guy with a dog comes in. They're staring at us, Kevin has told me later. So we stood there for a moment, and then I said, hey, Kevin, where are we doing this? He says, oh, we're going up here to the front. And I followed him up to the front. I was using my guide dog, Roselle, my 5th dog. And we got up there and set the laptop projector down, opened up the case, took it out, said, Kevin, where are we plugging this in? And he said, oh, we're going to plug it in over here. Just give me the cord, I'll plug it in. Okay. So while he was doing that, I got out my Braille script for my slides. I did the slideshow, the PowerPoint show. I had a very detailed Braille script. The script not only said all the verbiage that was on the slides, it had not only descriptions of the pictures on each slide, so I wouldn't forget them, but it even had details saying where on the screen each picture would appear. so that I could just point over my shoulder and say, you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, the ATLP 3000 with 16 tape drives, 326 tape cartridges, and you'll see this thing that says Prism Technology in the lower right-hand corner. That's so that we can hook a whole bunch of these together, and we can actually create a library that goes up to 80 tape drives and 1,630 tape cartridges. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see the small version of it, the ATLP 1000 and so on. You get the idea? And I could sit there and do all that stuff. Anyway, so I was getting everything out, and I turned to my left, your right as you're facing me, and talked to the person in the upper right-hand seat. I heard him as we passed by, and I said, "Hi, I'm Mike Hingson. Who are you?" And he didn't say a word. I said, "Really, I'm Mike Hingson. Who are you?" And he didn't say a word. And I said, "Okay, look, I heard you chewing gum as I walked by. I know you're there. You can't hide. Who are you?" And he finally said, "Oh, my name's Joe," or something like that. And I said, "Joe, glad to meet you. Thanks very much for inviting us. Why are we here?" "Oh, well, we want to learn about tape storage systems." I said, "Okay, why?" "Well, we got this project." "Well, tell me about it." Do you get the idea? I don't like yes and no and closed-ended questions in sales anyway. I ask questions to learn information. If I ask a question that has a yes or no answer, I really want to know what that answer is ahead of time. That is, I better know the answer because I don't want to get cut off. Well, I asked Joe a bunch of questions, and I asked the next person, and I got all these people talking by the time we went around the room, and I knew that our product wasn't for them. But everything was set up. We were there. They wanted us. We did the presentation. And at the end, I said, our product won't work for you, as you probably can see yourselves, but here's why it won't work. On the other hand, here's what will. Remember what I told you that Kevin said? It's the only thing we really have to sell. My bosses would have crucified me if they knew about it. Kevin or I were going to tell them that we were going to say our product wouldn't do a job. Anyway, at the end of the presentation, after telling them all that, one of the people came up and said, "We're really unhappy with you." And I said, "Why?" "Well, because you never looked away. We forgot you were blind. We didn't dare fall asleep." And I said, "Well, even if you had, it doesn't matter. The dog was down there taking notes. We would have got you." That's part of the advantage that I had. You see, when I took a Dale Carnegie sales course, when Kurzweil originally sent me into sales, I took a 10-week course that taught me a lot about sales. One of the most important things that I learned, probably the most important thing, certainly the most important life skill, and a skill that all of you need to teach to any of your students, is turn perceived liabilities into assets. I've had to sell all my life just to survive. So in getting sales jobs sometimes, I would say, you can just go off and hire anybody who sells, or do you want to hire somebody who understands sales for the science and art that it is? Because I've had to sell to convince people to let me take my guide dog on an airplane prior to the ACAA. I've had to sell to convince stores to let me take my guide dog in, notwithstanding the fact that there were laws prior to the ADA, and so on. So do you want to hire somebody who truly understands how to sell? Turn perceived liabilities into assets. That is a lesson and a strength that any of your students have. Now, maybe they all can't articulate it that well. They may need someone to help them. But the obvious assets are there if you look for them. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the problem with it is, and what the workshops do is, most everyone has some sort of job skill they can do. I was talking with a congressperson about a year ago about that law and why we need to repeal it. And he said, "Well, you can't have a person with Down syndrome working at Best Buy." I said, "Why not?" "Well, they can't do the job." "Which job can't they do?" "Well, they can't really go out and deal with customers." I said, "Well, maybe not. But, you know, who cleans the shelves at night? Who stocks the shelves? Might there be people who have the skills and the gifts to do that?" Which, by the way, I knew that there were people who did. "Oh, that's right, Congressman, Congresswoman," I don't even remember who. The reality is, all of us have gifts. And we all have the right to live in the world, and we all have the right to have opportunities. We just have to find what it is that someone can do. And I am sure that there are some people who really may not fit even that model, but they're not going to be in the competitive workforce. I was able to succeed at sales, and I was able to have that presentation at Solomon because of my attitude about myself and what I could do. By the way, 2 weeks after the presentation, we got a call from Solomon, and they said, we have another project. It's even larger than the one that we wanted you to consider and that we were considering for you, and because of everything that you taught us, we know that your products will do it. We're not putting it out for bid. Give us a price and we'll order it today. That's what it's about. Turn the perceived liability into an asset. Well, our product had a perceived liability in one project, but it certainly was a great asset in others. And that's what it's about. So we moved forward. And in August of 2001, Ingram Micro contacted us. Now, the way we sold products was we sold some directly. We also sold through distribution channel. Companies like Ingram Micro, big companies would buy our products, and then they in turn signed up smaller resellers who really didn't have the wherewithal to make huge commitments to manufacturers. So Ingram acted as a middle agent. They'd buy products from us, they would resell it to their resellers who would sell it to their customers, and so on. And they wanted us to train their resellers. We said, sure, let's set it up. I contacted David Frank, who was one of my colleagues at our corporate office. David was responsible for pricing for Ingram Micro and had the distribution relationship. And I said, David, we're going to do this. You want to come back? He said, yeah, I'd love to. So David was going to come back and deal with the pricing. I was going to deal with all of the technical stuff. I was going to deal with the whole process of doing the technical questions, doing the technical sales, being their general point of contact, and so on. And we set up the time to do it on the 11th of September, 2001. The day before, I went home, as I always did, took my laptop from the office and backed up all of my data on my computer at home. That was my second office. That was my offsite storage. So we went to bed that night, and about 12:30 in the morning, Roselle woke me up. She was very nervous. She was very jittery. We had seen that behavior in her before whenever a thunderstorm was approaching. We didn't hear it yet. She was about a half-hour early warning system because she felt the static charge build up in her fur, and she knew that there was going to be thunder and so on. She was just deathly afraid of thunder. She would shake and she would shiver and just couldn't cope with it. So we went down, Roselle and I, to my office in the basement. I turned on my stereo, turned up the volume. I decided to emboss some other things on my Braille embosser that I had at home, and had it there to prepare stuff that I was going to use the next day. I had planned on doing it at the office, but with the thunderstorm coming, I wanted to make as much noise as possible to try to hide Roselle from the thunder. But God has a sense of humor. The thunderstorm came right over our house. I mean, right over our house. It sounded like bombs exploding right outside. Poor Roselle was just shaking under my desk. She couldn't move other than just involuntarily shaking for about 45 minutes. At 2 o'clock, we went back up, went to bed, and 5 o'clock got up to go into the office. I got to the office about 7:40 in the morning. I'd planned on being there earlier, but wouldn't you know it, God does have a sense of humor. The New Jersey Transit train broke down before it got to Westfield, and we had to wait about a half hour for a new train. Go figure. But it was a nice day. With birds were chirping and singing, and it was quiet, it was warm, it was great. So a bunch of us sat around the Westfield, New Jersey train station, waited for the train. It came, we got on, we went into New Jersey to Newark, got on the PATH train, the Port Authority Trans-Hudson special train that went straight to the World Trade Center. And I got off the train, went through the underground parking garage, came up an elevator into One World Trade Center, scanned my security badge, went through the portal, got on another elevator that went straight to the 78th floor. We were on what was called a sky lobby floor. The sky lobby was one of two. There was one on the 44th floor and one on the 78th floor. You go to those floors, and then you took elevators from there to go to other floors. But our office was right on the 78th floor. Loved to try to convince people when we were inviting them to the office that we would arrange a special elevator to take them straight to our floors because they were so important. It was great. Some of them really bought it. It was sort of funny. But we got there, and there was a person at the door waiting when I arrived with a cart. It was breakfast that we had arranged for the early arrivals and for the first group of seminar people. We had 4 seminars scheduled, about 12 or 13 coming to each seminar. A total of 50 were going to come through that day. So I took him in. I told him where to set up the the food. I showed him where I wanted everything set up. I went into my office, got the laptop projector and my laptop, took it out, and mostly got the laptop set up. The only thing I'm not good at is really aiming the projector exactly to the right place on the screen. Can't get that from Braille script, but I knew David was coming, so we would get it aimed. And I could have asked the gentleman, but he had left by then because he was fast at setting up the food. Best ham and cheese croissants in New York. Anyway, David came at 8 o'clock with some of the early arrivals from Ingram Micro, and we started working, got the projector set up and aimed and all that, got it to the first slide, invited our guests to eat, chatted a little while, then David and I went into my office to do the last thing we had to do before starting the seminar, and that was that we had to create a list for the Port Authority. The list would have the names of all of the people who would be coming to the seminars. We had to prepare it, print it on letterhead, and fax it to the Port Authority so that they had an official copy of a list. Then when people came and said, we're invited to this seminar, we could say, or the Port Authority could say, what's your name? Show me your photo ID. Okay, you're on the list. They would have them stand in front of a camera, take a picture, laminate it on a badge, give them the badge, and they could go through and come up to our floor. If we didn't do all that, then we would have gotten 50 calls about 50 people coming that day. We didn't want to do that. That's a lot of work. So we created the list. I was reaching for stationery that we had in my file cabinet at 8:45 in the morning when suddenly we heard a muffled explosion. The building kind of quivered and shook. And then, and I'm now holding my hand straight up in the air, and I'm starting to tip it toward all of you straight out in front of me. The building began to tip, and it tipped, it just kept tipping. We moved about 20 feet. Now imagine a spring, and take the spring and fasten it to a table, and then push the top of the spring. That's what the building did. I spent a lot of time learning all I could about the World Trade Center, learning how to travel around the World Trade Center so I could move independently anywhere I needed to go. I could take guests to lunch. It wouldn't look very good if I were going to be going to lunch with guests and some of my employees, and I had to say, I don't know where to go because I'm blind, I can't see it. And then 2 hours later, we're supposed to negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts. It was important that I could say, you want to go somewhere? Where do you want to go? What kind of food? Oh, you want a deli sandwich? Fine in Shapiro downstairs serves really great deli food, and it's a lot closer than the Carnegie Deli up on 55th Street. Why don't we go there? And lead the way and take them there and sit them down, and go do what any manager should do. I had to do that. Any of us should have to do that. There is no excuse for us not doing it. And I learned how to do that. I also learned about emergency preparedness, learned about evacuation procedures, and so on. And every day I went in, I usually thought, if there's an emergency today, what do I do? Because I wanted to make sure that I had a mindset that prepared me that if there were an emergency, I could deal with it. So the building tipped. And David and I started saying to each other, what's going on? And he said, you think it's an earthquake? And I said, no, and I'm shaking my hand back and forth. It's not an earthquake. That wasn't what the building is doing. David was born in the Bronx. He didn't know about earthquakes. Come on, Even though he lived in California, he hadn't been in any real quake. He didn't get to experience an e-ticket ride at Disneyland, if you know what that is. I know those are old days, back in the day, as they say. Anyway, I said, it sounded like a little bit of an explosion. He said, yeah, but it didn't seem like much, and we're just not falling over. But the building kept tipping and tipping. Meanwhile, I did go, unlike what Marianne said this morning, because it was different then, I went and stood in the doorway. Because as anyone about physics knows, an archway is the most strongest point of a building. Any good engineer will tell you that. Yeah, it's going to really make a lot of sense when I was standing in a doorway on a non-bearing wall on the 78th floor, but hey, a door's a door. In any case, I was standing in the doorway. David was holding onto my desk. Roselle was asleep under my desk. And finally, David and I said goodbye to each other because we thought that we couldn't go further without the building falling 78 floors to the street. But then it started to slow down, and it stopped. And then it began to move back the other way as I'm now moving my hand back slowly and picking up speed, going back toward being vertical again. And finally, it got to be straight up and down again. As soon as it did, I went back into my office, and I met Roselle coming out from under my desk. I took her leash, and I told her to heel, which meant to come around on my left side, come on, over here, heel, and sit, which Roselle did. About that time, the building dropped straight down about 6 feet. Now, come on, I told you why. The building's like a big spring, right? You let the spring go, the expansion joints go back to their normal configuration, and that's what actually happened. As soon as the building, I'm being a little silly, but that is what happened. And who knew, right? But that's what occurred. As soon as the building stopped moving, David turned and looked out the window. The whole front of our office was glass, and he started saying, "Oh my God, Mike, the building's on fire. I see fire and smoke above us. There are millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window. We got to get out of here right now. The building's on fire." And I said, "Slow down, David." "No, we got to get out of here right now." Our guests began to scream. They started moving toward our exit. And I said, "Slow down, David. We'll get out. Don't worry. It's okay." No, you don't understand it. The building's on fire. I see millions of burning pieces of paper falling outside the window. I heard stuff falling outside the window. I was wondering what it was. David told me. Now I knew, right? Millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window. He could see fire above us. He could see smoke above us. I understood all that. And I kept saying, "Slow down, David." And he said, "No, we got to get out of here." Our guests began to scream. They started moving toward the exit. You got the picture? The sighted guy saying all this horrific stuff and the blind guy saying, "Slow down, stop." The problem wasn't what David was seeing, it was what David was not seeing. I have a very close relationship with my guide dogs. I already told you what Roselle was like when she was afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was yawning and wagging her tail and going, "Who woke me up? What's going on?" Good grief, I was doing good. I was having a good dream. What's going on here? So I knew that whatever was occurring wasn't such an imminent danger to us that we couldn't try to evacuate in an orderly way. I finally got David to focus, and I said, "Get our guests to the stairs. Don't let them take elevators, because if there's fire, it means that, in fact, if they're in the elevator and the fire gets into the elevator shafts, they could be burned." Because all the elevator shafts were in the central part of the building. It was a hollow core. And so it was very possible. And in fact, as we learned later, that is indeed what occurred. So David left. He got our guests to the stairs, as I learned later when he came back. Meanwhile, I called my wife, Karen. I told her that there had been an explosion or something in the World Trade Center, and we have to get out. She wanted to know more, and I said, "I don't know anymore." It was long before it was on the news. I scooped Good Morning America by 8 minutes. No one ever gives me credit for that. I want a job there. I'm a good reporter. No fake news from me. I'm amazed at the people who keep asking me about conspiracies and, the conspiracy theorists and so on. I just say, "Look, I was there, you weren't. Don't get into that with me." I felt what the building did. Anyway, he came back. I had just hung up with Karen. We collected a few things. We swept the office, and we got to the stairs and started down about 8:50 in the morning. 5 minutes after the plane hit. Immediately, I began smelling an odor. Now, understand the building was struck by an aircraft 18 floors above us on the other side of the building, and I'm pointing over my head and behind me. So we had no clue what happened. So I smelled this odor, and I realized it was familiar, but I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't place it. It took me about four floors to finally realize I was smelling the fumes from burning jet fuel. I said, "I know that smell, it's kerosene." I observed to the other people on the stairs around us, "I'm smelling fumes from burning jet fuel." And they said, "That's right, that's what it is, you're right. We must have been hit by an airplane." We didn't know, but we assumed. So we kept walking down the stairs. We got down to about the 78th floor when suddenly someone said above us, "Burn victim coming through, move to the side." The stairs are wide enough that you can walk 2 or 3 abreast, so we all just went to the side of the stairs and faced in toward the center, and soon this group of people passed us going down the stairs, surrounding a woman who was very badly burned, and I'm just touching my face, who was very badly burned over the upper part of her body. Her clothes had been burned away. I won't get more graphic. David was pretty descriptive. She was in shock, he said, but she could walk down the stairs, and she was walking, being helped by others. They passed us and went on their way. We kept going down, and then a few floors later, we heard it again. Burn victim coming through, move to the side, and we did. And another person very badly burned, even worse than the first, passed us on the stairs and kept going down the stairs. And then we did as well. We got to about the 50th floor. Everyone was talking and speculating. I noticed that David was getting pretty quiet, and all of a sudden David said, "Mike, we're going to die. We're not going to make it out of here." And immediately I thought of Voice 101 from my teacher's course, right? And I just said, "Stop it, David. If Roselle and I can get out of here, so can you." As loud and as sharp as I could. I told you I learned how to yell at students, right? I deliberately did that because I knew I had to bring him out of his funk. We didn't dare let panic ensue on the stairs. We had had another woman who had stopped somewhere on the stairs and said that she couldn't go on, and we just surrounded her and had a group hug, and we were able to keep her going. I said, "Come on, keep going." Other people said, "You can do it," and she kept going. Well, David just seemed a little different, so I snapped at him deliberately, and he told me later that brought him out of his funk, and what he then said he was going to do was to keep his mind off of what was going on. He was going to walk a floor below me and just shout up to me everything that he saw on the stairs. I said, "Okay." Did I need him to do it? No, because I had a lot to work on. But, what David did was really cool. And I think one of the most important things that happened that day, he goes downstairs, and I was walking down, so he gets to the 48th floor. "Mike, I'm on the 48th floor. Everything is good here. We're going on down." What David did was shout to me, but hundreds, perhaps thousands of people could hear him. He suddenly became a focal point for anyone within the sound of his voice. He gave everyone something to focus on. He had to help all those people by letting them know wherever they were and wherever he was okay. Above them, below him, whatever. He gave them a lifeline. That is as good as it gets. 47th floor, all clear, going on down. And I'm thinking, I just need to keep encouraging Roselle because I didn't want her to think I was nervous. And I didn't dare be nervous. I didn't have time to be. I had to focus on her. Good girl, Roselle, let's keep going. And in my trivial pursuit physics mind, I was going, how many stairs am I going to go down? I don't count steps. I absolutely do not believe in counting steps. I do not listen when people tell me how many stairs there are when I come to a stairwell with people, or I come to a set of steps going up or down, because invariably they'll tell me, "Oh, you're going to go up 6 steps," and they're off by a step. They miss a step. I have yet to figure out whether it's the top step or the bottom step, but they miss it. But the other reason I don't pay attention is that's the dog's job, or if I'm using a cane, it's the cane's job. If people tell me and I start anticipating, I'm going to not have the edge that I need to be a good traveler. I do not want people counting steps for me. I will use my cane or I will use my dog. That's what I should do. But also, as I said, they get it wrong. And so I don't generally count. But I was sitting there going, well, there's a lot of steps. I think I want to know. So as we were going down from the 47th floor when I got there, and David had just said, 46th floor, all good. Roselle, forward, counting the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Left, left, good girl, forward, down 9 steps. 46th floor. David, 45th floor, all good. 19 steps. Well, let's see if that continues. Roselle, forward, good girl, going down the steps. Down 10 steps. Left, left, 180 degrees. Forward, down 9 steps. 45th floor. David, 44th floor. Hey, this is where the cafeteria is, the Port Authority cafeteria. Not stopping, going on down. 19 steps again. Forward, Roselle. Good girl. Down 10 steps. Left, left, forward, down 9 steps. Maybe it is 19 steps between floors all the way down. I think we can assume that. Let's go with that assumption. So 19 steps between floors, going from 78 to 1, that's down 77 floors. 77 times 19 equals anyone? No calculators? I didn't have one on the stairs. You don't get one. Come on, you people who've read Thunderdog. 1,463 stairs. It was a guess. It was probably a good guess. We went on down. David, 44th floor. Hey, this is where the Port Authority cafeteria is. Not stopping, going on down. And we went on down the stairs, 43rd floor, 42nd floor. Got to the 40th floor, and it was getting pretty quiet again. I'm going, oh, I hope somebody isn't going to do what David did. I just said, I got to do something about this. So I said to people, hey, everyone, they're not going to let us back in the building for a while. There's fire. Let's all meet on the 78th floor at 8:45 on our first day back and walk down the stairs together. What a great way to lose weight, huh? And I also said, look, you know, my name is Mike. I happen to be blind. I've got my guide dog with me, but don't worry. If the power and lights go out on the stairs, we're here to offer you a half-price special to get you out today only. It kept people focused, you know, kept them moving. We got to the 30th floor, David did, and he said, hey, I see firefighters coming up the stairs. I went down to where he was, and he told everybody to move to the side, but I went down to where he was, and I said, what do you see? And he said, well, I see the firefighters coming up the stairs. They're in their heavy protective clothing, and they got these huge backpacks on their backs because they had to carry all the equipment up with them to fight the fire. And he said they're maybe 100 pounds. Well, it was about 50 or 60, but well, whatever. The first guy gets to us, and he stops right in front of me. He goes, hey, buddy, you okay? You know, you got to talk loud for a blind person to hear you. That happens more than you think. And I said, yeah, I'm good. And he said, well, that's really nice. We're going to send somebody down the stairs with you to make sure you get out. And I said, you don't need to do that. I came down from the 78th floor. We're good. Yeah, it's really nice. We're going to send somebody with you. And I said, look, I don't want any help. I don't need it. Well, yeah, but we're going to send somebody. And I said, look, I got my guide dog here. We're good. We're fine. We don't need any help. I came down from the 78th floor. Didn't have any problems. We're not going to have any problems going down. Well, that's really nice. He starts petting Roselle. It wasn't the time to give him a lecture. Don't pet a guide dog in harness. And don't, all of you, don't talk to her, don't pet her, don't look at her even, don't make eye contact with her. If she's got that harness on, do not do anything to indicate that you observe her. She's got a job to do, and anything that you do is going to distract her. You should always do that with any service animal. Now, you can ask me if you can pet her, and I'll tell you no. But if we have time, I will take the harness off, and I'll let you play all you want. The harness is her indicator that she's working. And if you pet her and stuff, you're going to get her in trouble. I will correct her, and then I'll deal with you. But if you just leave her alone and say, can I pet her? If I have time, I always will let people pet her if we have time. Why? Because she needs playtime. She needs time to relax. The harness does come off at home, but during the day, she needs her time. It's okay, but only when the harness is off. Wasn't the time to give him the lecture. It also wasn't the time to give him the lecture, blindness isn't the problem, it's your attitude. So I just said, look, I got my friend David over here. He can see where we're going down the stairs together. And he looks at David. Go to him. And David goes, yeah, leave him alone. So he gave Roselle a few more pats, and she gave him some kisses, and he then went up the stairs, probably just having received the last unconditional love he ever got in his life. Why did I really resist? Because he's part of a team, and I didn't want to break up that team. I didn't want to jeopardize them. We didn't know what was going on, but I did know that I didn't want to hear on the news later that somebody got injured because another one of the firefighters was helping a blind man go down the stairs, especially when there was no need. I didn't want to jeopardize their team relationship. And we were able to work through that. We went on down and got to the first floor and got out into the lobby of Tower 1. There were water sprinklers on, keeping a curtain of water across each stairwell. But when you went out into the lobby, it was ankle deep. The revolving doors are watertight. They were filling up the building with water. We got out there and people were shouting, go to your right, don't go over that way, don't go over this way, don't go to the outside. Now we know that they didn't want anyone going outside because they would have been right in the path of people who were jumping from up above. But they were just telling us what they wanted us to do. This guy from the FBI came up and introduced himself, and he took David and me in hand, and we ran through out into the central part of the World Trade Center, which was a shopping mall on the first floor. Right outside our lobby was Ben & Jerry's ice cream kiosk, darn no room to grab it in time to get a scoop. But anyway, we went on. Nobody was there. Perfect time to get a free scoop. But we ran through it and eventually ended up going up an escalator and outside into the sunlight at 9:45, an hour after the plane hit. The only thing we were told was to leave the area. Now, do you get the idea, though, that I like information? I would rather have known I could deal with it. And I can tell you categorically, I would rather have known, because it would have helped me make the best possible decision. It's a lack of information that tends to be a big challenge for me most of the time. And so we just didn't have time to get it. They wouldn't give it anyway, because they didn't want panic on the stairwell. They didn't want panic anywhere. We were just told to leave the area. But David looked around and said, "Mike, I see fire in Tower 2. I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." "What do you think it's from?" "I have no idea. The only thing we thought it could be is that maybe when our building tipped, it tipped and fire jumped across, but we didn't know." We went to Broadway and started walking north on Broadway, and we got to Vesey Street when suddenly a police officer yelled, "Get the hell out of here, it's coming down now!" And suddenly we heard this rumble that became this deafening roar. I describe it as kind of a combination sound of a freight train and a waterfall. You could hear metal clattering and glass tinkling, and then this white noise sound as the building just pancaked straight down. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, but everyone ran. David turned and he ran. He was gone. I lifted Roselle bodily to do it quickly and turned her around 180 degrees, and we started running back the way we came. And we just ran, and finally we got to Fulton Street, the next street over, going now south on Broadway, turned right on Fulton going west, and ran a little bit and suddenly caught up to David. It turns out he had gone the same way. He had stopped because he realized that he had left me and kind of got a little calm again. He was going to come back and find me, but before he did, I caught up with him, and he apologized. I said, "David, let's keep going." And he said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Just don't worry about it, keep going." And we ran, and suddenly we were engulfed in the dust cloud, all the dirt and debris from Tower 2's collapse. The dust cloud was so thick that David said he couldn't see his hand 6 inches in front of his face. I can tell you that the dirt and debris was so thick that with every breath I took, I could feel stuff going down my throat and settling in my lungs. We kept running. We knew we had to get out of that dust cloud, so I started yelling to Roselle, "Right, right," giving her hand signals as I'm waving right, right, hoping that she could see me or hear me. Didn't know whether she could do either. And I was also listening for an opening, and suddenly I heard one on the right. She obviously knew what I wanted. She did turn right. She took one step, she stopped, and she wouldn't move. "Come on, Roselle." She wouldn't move. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't afraid. She just wouldn't move. I realized had to be a reason. And I probed around and discovered that we were at the top of a flight of stairs. She had done her job perfectly. We walked down the stairs, and we were in this little arcade after going down 2 flights. It was the entrance to the Fulton Street subway station. We stayed there for a few minutes, and then a gentleman came up from further down in the subway system. He introduced himself as Lou, an employee of the system. And he took us and other people who were there down to the locker room for employees. And we were in this area for a while. There was a water fountain and so on, and fans. And we sat there not really understanding what was going on. And then a police officer came about 10 minutes later and said, "You need to leave, the air is clear up above." He turned and walked away, and we followed him back to the stairs, back up to the arcade area that I mentioned before, traveled through the arcade, up the last 2 flights of stairs, and got outside. We were told to leave the area, but David looked around and said, "Mike, oh my God, there's no World Trade Center Tower 2 anymore." And I said, "What do you see?" And he said, "All I see are fingers of fire and flame, hundreds of feet tall, pillars of smoke." And we just stood there and then turned, walked west, walked away. We walked for about 10 minutes, and then we were in a little arcade area, a little plaza, and we heard that freight train waterfall sound again, and we knew that it must be our building collapsing. David looked back and did see another dust cloud coming, so we kind of moved to the side. It was pretty concentrated. We hunkered down and covered our faces and just waited for everything to pass. And when it did, we stood up, and David looked around and said, "Oh my God, Mike, there's no World Trade Center anymore." And I said, "What do you see?" And again he said, "Fingers of fire and flame and pillars of smoke. The towers are gone." To think that 3 hours before we had gone into that building just to do our jobs and mind our business, in the blink of an eye it was gone. I tried to call Karen, and this time I got through to my wife, and she's the first one to tell us how 2 aircraft had deliberately been crashed into the towers, one into the Pentagon, and a 4th was still missing over Pennsylvania. Later that evening, I did get home. At 7 o'clock, a longtime friend of ours, Tom Painter, who was also living in New Jersey, had come to be with Karen, not knowing whether I was at home or working in the office that day. He drove her to the station in our van. We have an accessible van, but he drove. And I got to hug Karen again that night at 7 o'clock, and then we went home. The first thing I did is I took Roselle's harness off, and before she even wanted outside, she went and found her favorite tug bone and started picking a tug-of-war with my retired guide dog, Linny. If that doesn't put life in perspective, I don't know what does. The next day, I contacted Guide Dogs for the Blind, where I'd gotten my dog, and all of my dogs. And I spoke to, among others, the Director of Public Information Services, who wrote a story about us. And that led to being on Larry King Live and led to a lot of visibility in the media. And then people started calling and saying, would you come and tell us your story and tell us what we should learn? And I sort of thought, why do I want to sell computers when people want to just pay me to come and talk? Is that a salesperson's dream or what? But I realized if I could help people understand and deal with change and move on from change, if I could help people learn to overcome obstacles, if I could help people learn more about blindness and disabilities and guide dogs, it was worth it. And so I've been doing that for the last 16 years, which brings us to here today. All of you have a really awesome responsibility to work with kids, to teach them, and hopefully work with and teach parents. It's okay. Kids need to be kids no matter what their abilities or gifts that some have and others don't. I state again, we all have gifts that others don't. But we have to have the opportunity to grow and learn to use them. That won't happen if we're sheltered or locked away or not given the best possible access to a real education. And if we aren't treated with the same level of expectation that everyone else is, you all are the ones that have to change that and deal with it. I want to close by reading you 2 things. One, from Thunderdog, lessons I learned from Roselle on 9/11. And it goes like this. There's a time to work and a time to play. Know the difference. When the harness goes on, it's time to work. Work hard. Others are depending on you. Number 2, focus in and use all of your senses. Learn to tell the difference between a harmless thunderstorm and a true emergency. Don't let your sight get in the way of your vision. People always tell me, you're visually impaired. I say, I got a lot of vision. I just don't see. 3, sometimes the way is hard, but if you work together, someone will pass along a water bottle just when you need it. And that happened to us on the stairwell. Number 4, Roselle's favorite, always, but always kiss firefighters. Number 5, ignore distractions. There's more to life than playing fetch or chasing tennis balls. Number 6, listen carefully to those who are wiser and more experienced than you. They'll help you find the way. Number 7, don't stop until work is over. Sometimes being a hero is just doing your job. Number 8, the dust cloud won't last forever. Keep going and look for the way out. It will come. Number 9, shake off the dust and move on. Remember the first guide dog command, forward. And number 10, when work is over, play hard with your friends and don't forget to share your favorite Boda-bone. I've got one more thing I want to read from Dr. Tenbrook, a speech that he gave in 1956 entitled Within the Grace of God. It was delivered at the National Federation of the Blind Convention, the 16th convention in San Francisco. The last 2 paragraphs of that speech go like this, and I think it sums up as best as I can the philosophy we should all adopt, and it goes like this. In the 16th century, John Bradford made a famous remark which has ever since been held up to us as a model of Christian humility and correct charity. Seeing a beggar in his rags creeping along a wall through a flash of lightning in a stormy night, Bradford said, "But for the grace of God, there go I." Compassion was shown. Pity was shown. Charity was shown. Humility was shown. There was even an acknowledgement that the relative positions of the two could and might have been switched. Yet, despite the compassion, despite the pity, despite the charity, despite the humility, how insufferably arrogant. There was still an unbridgeable gulf between Bradford and the beggar. They were not one, but two. Whatever might have been, Bradford thought himself Bradford and the beggar a beggar. One high, the other low. One wise, the other misguided. One strong, the other weak. One virtuous, the other depraved. We do not and cannot take the Bradford approach. It is not just that beggary is the badge of our past and is still all too often the present symbol of social attitudes toward us, although that is at least a part of it. But in the broader sense, we are that beggar and he is each of us. We are made in the same image and out of the same ingredients. We have the same weaknesses and strengths, the same feelings, emotions, and drives. And we are the product of the same social and economic and other environmental forces. How much more consonant with the facts of individual and social life, how much more a part of a true humanity to say instead, there, within the grace of God, do go I. I can't say it any better than that. I don't know how much time you want to allow us for any questions, Miss Kathy?
We have about 2 minutes.
I know. Who's got a fast question?
And
Come
I've
on.
already got one question.
Yay.
So this is from our virtual audience.
Virtual. Hi,
Someone
virtual.
wants to know, they're out there, wave at them.
Hi, virtual.
When did you first provide verbal descriptions of your physical actions during presentations?
Almost from the beginning, because the first speech I ever gave, the very first speech was a speech to a church group. I was invited to come and talk to a church group, and they were going to do a service for all the people who were lost in New Jersey. It only happened to have about 6,000 people there. But after that, the first speech I was hired to give was actually a speech at a Canadian organization of blind guide dog users. So right from the beginning, I started giving verbal descriptions, and that's my nature anyway.
Are there any questions from our actual audience?
Oh, they're virtually actual too.
They're virtually actual, but they haven't sent any virtual questions.
So
Okay, if not,
I will tell you that we do have copies of Thunderdog for sale, and we'll have them this evening. We hope that you'll buy them. Africa has asked me to really encourage you to, because poor starving authors don't make a lot of money, and she needs kibbles. So, you know, she won't make it till tomorrow if you guys don't come and buy all the books that the Inclusion Collaborative has purchased. So we really we'll sign the books, you'll get autographs and so on, but we hope that you'll come. And I really want to thank you all for allowing us to come. If you know of anyone else that might need a speaker, this is what I do. In large part, this is what I do. And if I can help you, I want to do that. If I can be a resource for you, let me help. Thank you all very much.
thank you very much.
Nobody's ever